In this video, we'll go over the setup and process of rendering sequenced images. Timeflow includes its own rendering solution, which is recommended for rendering your creations to disk. This exports either JPEG or PNG image sequences, supporting a number of formats, including stereoscopic, 360 VR, and full dome format. To get started with rendering in any scene, we first need to create a render-to-disk item. The quickest way to do this is from the main menu, selecting Tools, Timeflow, Add Render to Disk. This creates a new game object with the Render to Disk component, which handles frame-by-frame rendering. In the inspector, we can configure the render and output settings. Initially, we'll see a warning that the render output directory hasn't been specified. Select any directory on your computer you wish to render to. It is strongly advised that you select a path outside of your assets directory, otherwise the rendered files will be imported into the project. We can then set the file name and number padding, with a preview of the output shown on the right. Next, we'll set the frame range, clicking the full range button to automatically set it to the full length of Timeflow. Note that rendering is based on frames, which depends on the frame rate used. If the Use Timeflow FPS checkbox is enabled, then rendering uses the frame rate set in Timeflow. However, you may choose to override this and set any frame rate you wish for rendering. Some of the other options in this section include the ability to renumber the output frames starting at any number. You can also use the pre-roll option to have Timeflow play from an earlier point up to the first frame of the render. This is helpful whenever you have particles or other simulated effects that need lead-in time to render properly. The timescale value can be used to slow down or speed up the entire scene and is only used in rare cases. And finally, the option to render every nth frame is a special feature to output frames and intervals, skipping the frames between. This can be useful to render out thumbnails for a sequence. The overlay options we won't go into detail here, but this allows a secondary camera to render over the main image, with options to display the current time, time remaining, and frame numbers. See the example scenes for a demonstration on how these features are used. In the last section, we have some additional options. The logging option determines how often render progress is output to the console log, which is helpful to monitor render progress and get an estimate for the time remaining. The debug pause option is helpful to troubleshoot issues that occur only when rendering that you cannot diagnose otherwise. When the specified frame number is reached, the editor application is paused for debugging, so you can more easily investigate objects and settings while the renderer is on hold. Use Force Global LOD 0 to globally force all models and assets to render at their highest level of detail. If this feature is disabled, there may be objects in the scene which render at a lower quality level, and sometimes in sequences, a visible pop can occur when an object transitions over the LOD threshold. To avoid this, forcing all LODs to 0 ensures that the highest quality is rendered no matter its distance from the camera. Lastly, we have the Hide On Render option, which takes a reference to a game object in the scene. This is useful to hide any objects which you want visible in the editor, but hidden during rendering. These objects are fully deactivated upon starting the render, and then reactivated upon exiting. Before we start the render, we'll first review the size and format options. The default setup uses the standard output format, which means it renders a single image per frame, and uses the screen capture mode, which is recommended for most rendering needs. We won't go into the specific details for each here, but to have a quick look, you can also render stereoscopic, using separate cameras for the left and right eyes, and outputting either separate or stacked images. You can also render to full dome format or fisheye lens. And finally, you can render to VR 360 with optional stereoscopic output. Please see the scenes under rendering for working examples of each format and refer to the documentation for further details. The output size of the render is specified by the game view. We can select from one of the existing sizes in the list or create one to enter any pixel resolution desired. Note that with very complex scenes requiring a lot of memory, crashing may occur, especially when rendering to high resolution. The only limitation is what your hardware is capable of handling. It is highly recommended that you always save your scene before starting a render. We can save our scene now and then press Start Render. If the auto checkbox is enabled, rendering will also start automatically upon entering play mode. Once rendering starts, a progress bar appears showing the frames being rendered. While rendering, the render to disk component takes over the update cycle to output each frame one at a time. If you are working in a scene with custom scripts that conflict with the render process, such as loading or unloading scenes, you may need to disable them to render without interruption. Once the render finishes, play mode is exited automatically, though we can also exit manually by stopping play mode or clicking the stop and exit button. We can then open up the output directory to see the results. The sequenced image files can then be converted into a video using a third-party tool such as Adobe Premiere, Handbrake, FFmpeg, or any number of tools depending on your preference. When you are done rendering, you can deactivate the render-to-disk object and save it for later use. One last topic we'll cover is using the render queue. Whenever you have multiple scenes to render, you can add them to the build scenes list and render them as a batch. This requires first setting up render to disk in each scene so that it is ready to render immediately upon play. Next, each of the scenes must be added to the build settings window, removing all other scenes. When your scene list is ready, open the render queue scene included in the examples and simply press play. This opens up each scene one at a time and renders its sequence, then exits play mode when finished. Whenever rendering, make sure the console window remains visible so you can check for potential errors or warnings. That completes this video on rendering. Please see the links in the video description below and documentation for further information. Next up, we'll go over using the tween behavior.